Hello and welcome to Wilde Old Times, a podcast about the strange and obscure corners of Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and today I'm going to be talking about the talented relatives of Oscar Wilde. It's the nature of the brightest lights that they cast all around them into shade. A candle will look insignificant next to a bonfire, no matter how much it shines. Oscar Wilde is one of the most famous of all Irish writers, both for his work and for his sensational personal life. Many other members of his family had talent and scandals of their own, but they all get swept away by the great man towering over them. For example, it's often forgotten that Oscar's mother Jane was probably the greatest female Irish writer of her generation, and that she was involved in one of the most scandalous trials in Dublin's history, for her alleged involvement in a crime far worse than anything her sons ever did. Jane Francesca Agnes Elgie was born in County Wexford in 1821. Her father Charles was a solicitor, but he died when Jane was only 3 years old. His family were pretty well off, though, and supported Jane, her mother, and her sister. Jane was taught by a great number of talented people and soaked all the knowledge in like a sponge. For example, by the time she was 18 years old, she had already learned 10 different European languages. Jane's family were staunchly Unionist, coming as they did from English stock. Jane herself wasn't interested in national politics until 1845, when she saw the funeral procession of Thomas Davis and heard that he was a poet. Curious, she looked into his writings and discovered a new world. Davis is often credited as being the writer who inspired the Irish nationalist movement of the 19th century, despite his death at the age of 30 from scarlet fever. A Protestant himself, he espoused a nationalism that ignored ethnic or religious identity in favour of an inclusive Irishness. Jane was captivated by these ideas and ideals. She wrote a passionate letter to The Nation, a nationalist newspaper. She signed it as John Farnsworth Ellis, since she didn't think they'd take a woman seriously. The letter caught the eye of editor Charles Gavin Duffy, and he wrote back offering John Ellis work. He was surprised to find out that John was actually a 20-year-old woman, but he didn't take back the offer. And just like that, Jane's writing career began. Like most of the writers in the paper, she had to choose a pen name. Inspired perhaps by an Italian great-grandfather, and by the perception of Italy as the birthplace of nationalism, she chose the name Speranza, the Italian word for hope. At first, she used her expertise with languages to produce translations of continental revolutionary poems, but she soon began contributing her own poems as well. The Nation was, by its nature, a controversial paper producing controversial content, and Speranza became known as one of its most fiery writers. Duffy was an ardent admirer and described her as the spirit of Irish liberty embodied in a stately and beautiful woman. These were the years of the Great Famine, and Jane wrote eloquently about the millions dying in Ireland while, quote, stately ships to bear our food away arrived daily. Her most popular poem was The Brothers, a lament for the two leaders of the 1798 Rising that was turned into a popular Dublin street ballad. Pale martyrs, ye may cease, your days are numbered. Next noon your sun of life goes down. One day between the sentence and the scaffold. One day between the torture and the crown. A hymn of joy is rising from creation. Bright the azure of the glorious summer sky. But human hearts weep sore in lamentation, for the brothers are led forth to die. One important piece of writing that Speranza produced for The Nation was an unsigned editorial titled Jacta alia est, which means The Die is Cast. A wave of revolutions were sweeping across Europe in 1848, prompted by the deposition of the French monarchy and the forced resignation of the conservative German minister Metternich. Speranza called for Ireland to join in the revolutions. And in fact it did, with the Young Irelander Rebellion, though that was more a single riot than a full-blown rising. It's most notable for causing the future founders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood to have to flee the country, which we've mentioned in the past. Still, the article by Speranza was one of the grounds given for the arrest of Charles Gavin Duffy for his sedition that year. When Duffy denied having written the article, Jane stood up in court and took credit for it. Perhaps luckily the judge seems to have decided to ignore her. The Nation was revived later in 1848, and Jane resumed writing for it. While Duffy was in prison, she even took on some of his editorial duties. She also began publishing translations of European novels, Sidonia the Sorceress by William Mannheim, and The Glacier Land by Alexander Dumas. By now, she had also begun to absorb the ideals of early feminism, writing about women. Quote, "At present they have neither dignity nor position. All avenues to wealth and rank are closed to them. The state takes no notice of their existence except to injure them by its laws." Yet she was not so liberated as to throw men off entirely, and in 1851 she married William Wilde. He was one of Dublin's most eligible bachelors, a doctor specialising in eye issues, and 2 years after their marriage he was appointed oculist in ordinary to Queen Victoria herself. He was also a writer of non-fiction, and the editor of the Dublin Journal of Medical Science. Jane may have been attracted by his tales of travel, as he had journeyed to the Middle East in his 20s. She was under no illusions as to his prior character, as he had several illegitimate children he openly acknowledged. One, Henry Wilson, was 13 years old at the time of their wedding. He also had 2 daughters named Emily and Mary, aged 4 and 2 years old. William provided for the children and even took Henry on as an assistant several years later when he had grown up and completed his medical training. Jane and William had their first child in 1852 and named him William after his father, though he was always known as Willie. 2 years later they had a second son, who was the infamous Oscar Wilde, and 2 years after that they had a daughter, who they named Isola. Throughout this time, Jane continued to write poetry, and she became a popular figure thanks to her nationalist stance and her eloquent writing. In 1864, she had a book of poems published. That was the same year that Jane and William wound up in court, due to the accusations of Mary Travers. To study history is to peer through a looking glass at facts forever out of focus. We can never know the truth behind stories like the one I'm about to tell. While it's easy for us to pass judgment on the past, we have to acknowledge that we don't really know exactly what happened. All we can do is state the facts of the case as they have been recorded. With that disclaimer, let us examine the tragic history of Mary Travers. She was the daughter of a friend of William and became his patient in 1854 due to some trouble she had with her hearing. She was 19 years old at the time. Through their treatment, she and William struck up a friendship, and Mary became a frequent guest at the Wilde home. William and Jane would later claim this was a friendship with a young girl who had a crush on William that spiraled into obsession. If that is true, then William is also to blame for encouraging her. The two exchanged passionate letters back and forth. It's possible they did have an affair and it ended badly, but that's something we can only speculate. The concrete fact is that Mary made a shocking claim in 1863. She said that after some mutual flirtation over the years, in 1862, she was rendered unconscious by William while he was examining her in his surgery, and he raped her. There is no direct evidence to back up Mary's claims, but of course there wouldn't be. There are contradictions between her account and her behaviour, but there is also strong supporting evidence in the change of tone in the letters between her and William. He urged her, "Do keep quiet, dear, for a while and see what is best to be done." Mary didn't tell anyone about what had happened, but she did seem to become intent on self-harm during 1863. In January, after a ferocious argument, Mary stormed out of William's study, took a bottle of laudanum large enough for an overdose, and then returned and drank it in front of him. She survived because William took her to a pharmacy and got some emetic medicine to make her vomit it up. He accused her of trying to frame him for poisoning her. On another occasion, Mary created a fake notice of Jane's death and sent it to her. In August, Mary called on Jane, and Jane refused to see her. Mary then sent her one of William's more passionate letters, only to have it returned with a cover note saying that Jane had no interest in the subject. This seems to have pushed Mary over the edge into going public. Mary wrote a pamphlet called Florence Boyle Price, or A Warning. It was the story of a girl named Florence who was put under with chloroform by the villainous Dr. Quilp and raped, and who was then given short shrift by Mrs. Quilp when she tried to appeal to her. Leaving no doubt as to her target, she signed the pamphlets Speranza. Mary then sent copies of the pamphlets to the Wilde's friends and paid to have extracts published in the Dublin Weekly Advertiser. She also allegedly began badgering William for money, implying that the harassment would stop if he paid up. This is all according to William, who also said that he refused it. In 1864, William was knighted for his services to medicine and to the Irish census, which infuriated Mary. She stepped up her campaign, and in April of 1864 it reached its peak. William and Jane arrived at the Metropolitan Hall in Abbey Street, where William was to give a public lecture. There they found 5 newsboys selling copies of Florence Boyle Price for a penny each. They were wrapped in a fly sheet that included extracts from William's letters to Mary and a header explicitly naming him. This was too much for Jane, and she left for Bray with Isola. There a boy called to the door, selling copies of the pamphlets. When the young Isola began asking questions, Jane seized the pamphlets from the boy. As a result, Mary had her summoned in Bray Court for theft and threatening behaviour. This provoked Jane to write an angry letter to Mary's father. In it, she referred to Mary's disreputable conduct and that she consorted with the low newspaper boys at Bray. She also referred to Mary's demand for money from William as the wages of disgrace. Mary managed to get hold of the letter and gave it to her solicitor, who used it to sue Jane for libel. Since the law at the time held a husband responsible for his wife's actions, William was included in the suit. The trial was set for December of 1864 and was, naturally, a public sensation. Ironically, Mary's lawyer was Sir Isaac Butt. He was the counsel who had defended Gavin Duffy back in 1848 when Jane had stood up to claim responsibility for Jacta Alia Est. There had been gossip at the time that Isaac and Jane had an affair, and that Isaac's wife had caught them in the act. If that was so, he did not allow sentimentality to taint his treatment of her in court. He portrayed her during questioning as a pitiless wife, sacrificing a young woman to protect her husband's reputation. He also accused her of implying that Mary was a prostitute, due to her wages of disgrace comment. Jane was not perturbed, and claimed that Mary was a woman driven off the rails by having been socially slighted, who had concocted the whole affair to get back at her. She did well in court, but her husband refused to take the dock, which weakened their side of the case considerably. The other side of the case was not that strong either, mostly due to how Mary demanded her lawyers presented. She insisted that they make her alleged rape by Sir William Wilde a central part of their case, even though it had no relevance to the libel charge. This was to put her accusations out in the public domain directly in a way that shielded her from a libel charge of her own. In his summing up, the judge was deeply unsympathetic, pointing out the inconsistencies in her charges and asking why she had not come forward at the time. This shows how little has changed in the treatment of this complex area down the centuries. The case ended with Mary being awarded damages for libel of 1 farthing, the lowest denomination of coin at the time. This was a traditional way for the courts to signal that they thought the case was valid but worthless, and that the charges should not have been raised. The jury might have had some sympathy for Mary, though, as they awarded her costs. This meant that the Wildes did have to pay around £2,000 to cover Sir Isaac Butt's fees. It was the damage to both Mary and Sir William's reputation that was to prove far more severe in the long run. Mary, of course, was treated as a fallen woman by the public. Sir William refusing to take the stand was seen as cowardly, and his letters to Mary as at best disloyal to his family. Jane, however, came out of the affair with a reputation enhanced. Both the papers and popular opinion were very much on her side, and felt that both of the others had made her a victim in their struggle. The trial was essentially the end of Jane and William's marriage, though they never divorced. One of the last knots tying them together was their children, and especially their young daughter Isola. In 1867, aged only 9 years old, Isola died of a fever. Oscar was especially affected by her death, and he would carry a lock of her hair with him until the day he died. William left Dublin, and spent most of his time at a house he built near the village of Cong in County Mayo, studying the nearby stone circles and other archaeological sites. He suffered another blow in 1871, when his two daughters from before his marriage to Jane died in a tragic accident. Emily and Mary, who were by now in their 20s, attended a party in County Monaghan. As Emily was dancing, her dress trailed into a fireplace, and the dry crinoline skirt went up in flames. Mary rushed to rescue her sister, only for her own dress to also catch light. Both were severely burned, and died of their injuries a few weeks later. William never recovered from these tragedies and died in 1876, aged only 61 years old. Jane remained in Dublin, where she became known for hosting artistic salons. These were meetings of creative and bohemian people in the Parisian style. As William and Oscar grew into men and began their own literary careers, the salons helped them forge connections. All of that came to an end when Sir William Wilde died in 1876. Like many of his generation, he had used his title and connections to keep creditors at bay, and Jane was shocked to learn she had been living beyond her means for years. She was left on the edge of bankruptcy and was forced to go back to writing for a living. Luckily, Oscar had won a scholarship to Oxford, so he needed no support. Willie had qualified as a lawyer, but he never actually practiced law and became a journalist instead. In 1879, Jane and Willie sold the Dublin house and moved to London in order to advance their careers. Jane had no problem trading on her existing fame to sell articles to prestigious magazines like the Pall Mall Gazette. Willie had a slightly more checkered career. Although Oscar was the younger brother, he was much more established in London when Willie moved there. The two brothers had extremely similar appearances, enough that Oscar allegedly paid his brother to grow a beard to disguise it. Willie was smart and funny, just like his brother, but in a more genial and less quotable way. He was a gifted writer of non-fiction, with a talent for creating snappy and informative articles. But his great sin was laziness. His talent landed him a job as a correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. But once he had that steady employment, he focused on doing the bare minimum he needed to do to keep it. He boasted that he would arrive at the newspaper offices at noon, come up with the idea for an article, take a long lunch, then go to his club and spend an hour writing it, then drop it off at the office and be done for the day. The only time he seemed to put much effort into his job was in 1888, when he was assigned to cover the Parnell Commission. This was a judicial commission investigating allegations that the Irish Parliamentary Party were linked to terrorist actions in Ireland at the time. Specifically, the Times had published a letter alleged to be from Charles Stewart Parnell, leader of the IPP. The letter condoned the murder of the Chief Secretary for Ireland and his permanent Under-Secretary by the Irish National Invincibles 5 years earlier. Parnell had denounced the letter as a forgery in Parliament, and this led to the commission being set up. The end result of the commission was that the forgery was exposed, the forger fled to Madrid, and Parnell brought a successful libel action against the Times. This took a while, though, and in the meantime the commission also served as a platform for the Unionists and Home Rule parties to put their opinions out to the public. The commission was open to everyone, and both Oscar and Willie were regular audience members. Willie wrote a series of pro-Parnell articles in the Daily Chronicle about the commission, and was probably the high point of his writing career. A running joke between Willie and his friends was his desire to marry a rich heiress and give up on work entirely. In 1891, his wish came true. That year, he married Frank Leslie, the widowed owner of a New York publishing company. She had been born as Miriam Follen, and Frank Leslie was her third husband. He founded the Frank Leslie Publishing Company and ran it into near bankruptcy. When he died, Miriam changed her name to match the company and turned it into a massively successful business. She was 16 years older than Willie, aged 55 to his 39. Oscar told Willie to make sure and get a prenuptial agreement in writing, but he did not. The marriage lasted less than a year, as Miriam had little patience with his drinking and infidelity. He returned to London, where he became more and more jealous of Oscar's success. Oscar was equally unhappy with Willie. As though he was happy to lend his brother money, he was angry when he found out that Willie had also been sponging off their mother Jane. Worse was to follow, as in 1894, Willie married his lover Sophie Lees when she thought she was pregnant. She was not. The penniless couple moved in with Jane, straining her even further. She was in her 70s, and ill-suited to be playing host to her drunken son and his wife. In 1895, Sophie actually became pregnant with a daughter, Dolly. Jane did her best to reconcile the two brothers, but before the baby was born, Oscar would fall meteorically from grace. Oscar Wilde's downfall is well documented, but for anyone who's unfamiliar, here's the short version. Although Oscar was married and had 2 children, he had realized he was gay in 1886 and enthusiastically embraced his new sexuality. At the time, homosexuality was illegal, but generally ignored among the more privileged classes. One of his most prominent lovers was Lord Alfred Douglas, who went by the name of Bosie. Bosie's father, John, the Marquess of Queensberry, detested Oscar. In 1895, John publicly accused Oscar of homosexuality. Oscar, driven by arrogance and egged on by Bosie, sued the Marquess for libel. John Douglas was able to prove that the allegations were true, and Oscar was arrested and sent to prison for 2 years for being a gay man. Incidentally, Bosie avoided all consequences and went on to pivot into being a right-wing anti-Semite in the 1920s. The trial was a huge burden on Jane, exacerbated by guilt. She had told Oscar not to flee to France when he lost the libel trial, and so she felt that his imprisonment was her fault. In January of 1896, she fell ill with bronchitis. Knowing that she was dying, she appealed to be allowed to visit Oscar in jail, but her appeal was refused. She died on the 3rd of February. It was later said that her ghost appeared in Oscar's cell the moment she died. Oscar was released from jail in May of 1897 and sailed for France the same day. He didn't visit Willie, and the 2 brothers never saw each other again. Willie died in 1899, aged 46, from complications of alcoholism. Dolly was only 4 years old. Oscar died the following year, leaving behind 2 sons, Cyril and Vivian. Cyril was 15 and Vivian was 14. In the aftermath of the trial, their mother had changed their surname to Holland and moved to Switzerland to escape the scandal. She had died 2 years earlier in 1898, and the boys had moved back to England. Their mother's family did their best to avoid them being linked to their father and to keep them anonymous. Dolly, on the other hand, grew up idolizing the uncle she had never met. Perhaps because of this, she realized very early on in her life that she was also gay. Dolly didn't speak much about her early life, except that she spent most of it at a country convent. What changed her life was what changed everyone's lives in the 1910s, World War I. When Britain joined the war in August of 1914, Dolly was 19 years old, Cyril was 29 and Vivian was 28. Cyril was already a captain in the British Army, who had been serving in India for the last few years. Vivian was a lawyer and aspiring author. With his expertise in European languages, he was able to get a commission as a 2nd lieutenant in the Interpreter Corps. Dolly volunteered as an ambulance driver, ferrying casualties from the front lines back to Paris. 1 in 8 British soldiers did not come back home from the Great War, and Cyril was one of them. Junior officers like him suffered the most casualties. Like many others, he was killed by a sniper in 1915. Vivian survived the war, though he returned home to tragedy. His wife, who he had married only a few months before the war, died in October 1918. She died the same way as Vivian's 2 aunts had died before he was born. Her dress caught fire and she died from the injuries. Dolly didn't come home to London, but not for any tragic reason. She found out that Paris was one of the few places in the world at that time where you could live as an openly lesbian woman. The heart of lesbian society in Paris was the weekly salon hosted by Natalie Clifford Barney, which had begun in the 1900s and continued throughout the war. Natalie was an American who had moved to Paris with her mother when she was young and settled in the city. Her salon gathered together lesbians, feminists, and free thinkers, providing a haven from a world that often judged them harshly. The writer Radcliffe Hall described Natalie as a, quote, charming and cultured woman, a kind of lighthouse in a storm-swept ocean. One of the people swept onto her shores in the 1920s was Dolly. Dolly was not in great shape at that point in her life. She was suffering from depression and had become addicted to heroin. Natalie and Dolly became lovers, despite their age gap. Natalie was just turning 50, while Dolly was in her 30s. Wasn't this age gap that doomed their romance, or Dolly's ongoing struggle with heroin, but another war? As the Germans approached Paris in 1940, Dolly fled to England and Natalie to Italy. They may have known it would be a final parting. Dolly had been diagnosed with breast cancer the year before. She died in 1941. Vivian spent the Second World War as he had the First, as a translator, this time for the BBC. During the war, he met and married his second wife. Their son Merlin was born in 1945. By 1954, Vivian had made his peace with his family history, and his autobiography was called simply Son of Oscar Wilde. Merlin grew up to become a historian and a writer. His main focus has been, of course, his famous grandfather, and he's become probably the greatest authority in the world on Oscar Wilde's life. It's hard to live in the shade of a great man, but with enough time passing, the great man becomes a fixture of history. History is often dark, and misconceptions can multiply. We are the link to our ancestors, and people like Merlin show us the value of that link in cutting through those layers of history. Personally, I think he's grasped a truth that his great-uncle Willie never did. Despite the existence of bonfires, candles still burn bright. This has been Wilde Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wilde Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.